Chapter 12 The Wolves. For a time during the day, Taran believed they had at last outdistanced the Cauldron-born. But, late that afternoon, the warriors reappeared from behind a distant fringe of trees. Against the westering sun, the long shadows of the horsemen reached across the hill slope toward the flatlands where the small troop struggled onward. "We must stand against them sooner or later," Taran said, wiping his forehead. "Let it be now. There can be no victory over the Cauldron-born, but with luck we can hold them off a little while. If Ilonwy and Gurgi can escape, there is still a chance." Gurgi, draped over Malinger's saddle, immediately set up with a great outcry. "No, no! Faithful Gurgi stays with mighty lord who spared his poor tender head. Happy, grateful Gurgi will fight too, with slashings and gashings." "We appreciate your sentiments," said Fflewddur, "but with that leg of yours you're hardly up to slashing or gashing or anything at all." "I'm not going to run either," put in Ilonwy. "I'm tired of running and having my face scratched and my robe torn, all on account of those stupid warriors." She jumped lightly from the saddle, snatched a bow and a handful of arrows from Taran's pack. "Ilonwy, stop! These are deathless men. They cannot be killed." Although encumbered by the long sword hanging from her shoulder, Ilonwy ran faster than Taran. By the time he caught up with her, she had climbed the hillock and was stringing the bow. The Cauldron-born galloped across the plain. The sun glinted on their drawn swords. Taran seized the girl by the waist and tried to pull her away. He received a sharp kick in the shins. "Must you always interfere with everything?" Ilonwy asked. Before Taran could reach for her again, she held an arrow toward the sun and murmured a strange phrase. She knocked the arrow and loosed it in the direction of the Cauldron-born. The arrow arched up and then almost disappeared against the bright rays. Open-mouthed, Taran watched as the shaft began its descent. As the arrow plummeted toward earth, long silvery streamers sprang from its feathers. In a distant, huge spider web, it glittered in the air and drifted slowly toward the horsemen. Fflewddur, who had run up just then, stopped in amazement. "Great Balin! What's that? It looks like decorations for a feast." The web slowly settled over the Cauldron-born, but the pallid warriors paid it no heed. They spurred their mounts onward. The strands of web broke and melted away. Ilonwy clapped her hands to her mouth. "It didn't work," she said, almost in tears. "The way Akron does it, it makes it into a big sticky rope. Oh, it's gone all wrong. I tried to listen behind the door and when she was practicing. I must have messed something important up." She stamped her foot and turned away. "Take her from here," Taran called to the bard. He unsheathed his sword and faced the Cauldron-born. Within moments, they would be upon him. But even as he braced for their onslaught, he saw the horsemen falter. The Cauldron-born reined up suddenly, then, without gesture, turned their horses and rode silently back toward the hills. "It worked after all!" cried the astonished Fflewddur. Ilonwy shook her head. "No," she said with discouragement. "Something turned them away, but I'm afraid it wasn't my spell." She unstrung the bow and picked up the arrows she had dropped. "I think I know what it was," Taran said. "They're returning to Arryn. Gwydion told me they could not stay long from Annyevan. Their power must have been waning ever since we reached Spiral Castle, and they reached the limit of their strength right here." "I hope they don't have enough to get back to Annyevan," said Ilonwy. "I hope they fall to pieces and shrivel up like bats." "I doubt they will," Taran said, watching the horsemen slowly disappear over the ridge. "They must know how far they can stay and how far they can go till they can and still return to their master." He gave Ilonwy an admiring glance. "It doesn't matter. They're gone. And that was one of the most amazing things I have ever seen. Gwydion had a mesh of grass that burst into flames, but I've never met anyone who could make a web like that." Ilonwy looked at him in surprise. Her cheeks blushed brighter than the sunset. "Why, Tarn of Caer Dallben," she said. I think that's the first polite thing you've said to me." Then suddenly Eilonwy tossed her head and sniffed. "Of course I should have known. It was the spider web. You were more interested in that. You didn't care whether I was in danger." And she strode haughtily back to Gurgi and Mullinger. "But that's not true," Torrin said. I was..." And by the time Eilonwy was out of earshot, crestfallen, Torrin followed her. "I can't make any sense out of that girl," he said to the bard. "Can you?" "Never mind," said Fflewddur. "We really aren't expected to." That night they continued to take turns standing guard. Though much of their fear had lifted since the Cauldron-born had vanished, Torrin was the last watch before dawn, and he was awake before Eilonwy's had ended. "You'd better sleep," he told her. "I'll finish the watch for you." "I'm perfectly able to do my share," said Eilonwy, who would not stop being irritated at him since the afternoon. Torrin knew better than to insist. He picked up his bow and quiver of arrows and stood next to the dark trunk of an oak, and looked out across the moon-silvered meadow. Nearby, Fflewddur snored heartily. Gurgi, whose leg had shown no improvement, stirred restlessly and whimpered in his sleep. "You know," Torrin said with embarrassed hesitation, "that spider web—" "I don't want to hear anything more about it," retorted Eilonwy. "No. What I meant was, I was really worried about you, but the web surprised me so much that I forgot to mention it. It was courageous of you to stand up against the Cauldron Warriors. I just wanted to tell you that." "Well, you took long enough about getting around to it," said Eilonwy with a tone of satisfaction in her voice. "But I imagine assistant pigkeepers tend to be slower than what you might expect. It probably comes from the kind of work they do. Don't misunderstand. I think it's awfully important. Only it's the sort of thing you don't need to be very quick about." "At first," Torrin went on, "I thought I would be able to reach Caer Dathel by myself. I now see that I wouldn't have gotten even this far without help. It is a good destiny that brought me such brave companions." "There you've gone and done it again," Eilonwy said, so heatedly that Fflewddur choked on one of his snores. "That's all you care about. Someone to help you carry spears and swords and what all. It could be anybody, and you'd be just as pleased. Torrin of Caer Dallben, I'm not speaking to you anymore." "At home," Torrin said to himself. Eilonwy had already pulled the cloak over her head and was feigning sleep. "Nothing ever happened. Now, everything happens. But somehow I can never seem to make it come out right." With a sigh, he held his bow ready and began to turn at guard. Daylight was long in coming. In the morning, Torrin saw Gurgi's leg was much worse, and he left the campsite to search for the woods for healing plants that Cold taught him of the herbs. He made a poultice and set it on Gurgi's wound. Fflewddur, meanwhile, had begun drawing new maps with his dagger. The Cauldron Warriors, explained the bard, had forced the companions too deeply into the Ystrad Valley. Returning to their original path would cost them at least 2 days of hard travel. "Since we're this far," Fflewddur went on, "we might just as well cross the Ystrad and follow along the hills, staying out of sight of the Horned King. We'll only be a few days from Caer Dathel, and if we keep a good pace, we should reach it just in time." Torrin agreed to the new plan. It would, he realized, be more difficult, but he judged Mullinger could still carry the unfortunate Gurgi as long as the companions shared the burden of the weapons. Eilonwy, having forgot she was not speaking to Torrin, again insisted on walking. A day's march brought them to the banks of the Ystrad. Torrin stole cautiously ahead. Looking down the broad valley, he saw a moving dust cloud. When he hurried back and reported this to Fflewddur, the bard clapped him on the shoulder. "We're ahead of them! That's excellent news! I was afraid they'd be much closer to us and we'd have to wait for nightfall to cross the Ystrad. We've saved half a day. Hurry, and we'll be on into the foothills of the Eagle Mountains before sundown." With his precious harp above his head, Fflewddur plunged into the river, and the others followed. Here the estrade ran shallow, scarcely above Eilonwy's waist, and the companions forded it with little difficulty. Nevertheless, they emerged cold and dripping, and the setting sun neither dried nor warmed them. Leaving the estrade behind, the companions climbed slopes steeper and rockier than any they'd ever traveled before. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but the air of the land around Spiral Castle seemed to Taran to be heavy and oppressive. Approaching the Eagle Mountains, Taran felt his burden lighten as he inhaled the dry, spicy scent of pine. He had planned to continue the march throughout most of the night, but Gurgi's condition had worsened, and obliging Taran to call a halt. Despite the herbs, Gurgi's leg was badly inflamed, and he shivered with fever. He looked thin and sad, and even the suggestion of crunchings and munchings could not rouse him. Mullingar also showed concern. As Gurgi laid with his eyes half closed, his lips parched against his teeth, the white mare nuzzled him delicately, whinnying and blowing out her breath anxiously, as if attempting to comfort him as best she could. Taran risked lighting a small fire. He and Fflewddur stretched Gurgi out beside it, while Eilonwy held the suffering creature's head and gave him a drink from the leather flask. Taran and the bard moved a little away and spoke quietly between themselves. "I've done all I know how to do. If there is anything else, it lies beyond my skill." He shook his head sorrowfully. "He has failed badly today, and there's so little left of him that I believe I could pick him up with one hand." "Caerdathal is not far away," said Fflewddur, "but our friend, I fear, may not live to see it." That night wolves howled in the darkness beyond the fire. All the next day the wolves followed them, sometimes silently, sometimes barking as if to signal one another. They remained always out of bowshot, but Taran caught sight of a lean gray shapes flickering in and out of the scrubby trees. "As long as they don't come any closer," he said to the bard, "we needn't worry about them." "Oh, they won't attack us," Fflewddur said. "Not now, at any rate. They can be infuriatingly patient if they know someone's wounded." He turned an anxious eye toward Gurgi. "For them, it's just a matter of waiting." "Well, I must say you're a cheerful one," Eilonwy remarked. "You sound as if all we had to look forward to was being gobbled up." "If they attack, we shall stand them off," Taran said quietly. "Gurgi was willing to put up his life for us. I can do no less for him. Above all, we must not lose heart so close to the end of our journey." "A flam never loses heart, come wolves or what have you." Nevertheless, uneasiness settled over the companions as the gray shapes continued trailing toward them, and Mullingar, docile and obedient until now, turned skittish. The golden-maned horse tossed her head and rolled her eyes with every attempt to lead her. To make matters worse, Fflewddur declared their progress through the hills was too slow. "If we go any further east," said the bard, "we'll run into some really high mountains. The condition we're in, we couldn't possibly climb them. But here, we're practically walled in. Every path is led to a roundabout. The cliffs there," he went on, pointing toward the mass of overhanging rock to his left, "are too rugged to get over. I thought we'd find a pass before now. Well, that's the way of it. We can only keep bearing north as much as possible." "The wolves didn't seem to have any trouble finding their way," said Eilonwy. "My dear girl," answered the bard with some indignation, "if I were able to run on 4 legs and sniff my dinner from a mile away, I doubt I'd have any difficulties either." Eilonwy giggled. "Well, I'd like to see you try." "We do have someone who can run on 4 legs, Taran said suddenly. "Mullingar. If anyone can find their way to Caerdathal, she can." The bard snapped his fingers. "That's it. Every horse knows its way home. It's worth trying, and we can't be any worse off than we are now." "For an assistant pig keeper," said Eilonwy to Taran, "you do come up with some interesting ideas now and then." When the companions started off again, Taran dropped her bridle and gave Mullingar her head. With the half-conscious Gurgis bound to her saddle, the white horse trotted swiftly ahead at a determined gait. By mid-afternoon, Malinger discovered one patch which, Flutter admitted, he himself would have overlooked. As the day wore on, Malinger led them swiftly through the rocky defiles into high ridges. It was all the companions could do to keep up with her. When she cantered into a long ravine, Taran lost sight of her for a moment and hurried forward to glimpse the mare as she turned sharply to an outcropping of white stone. Calling the Bard and Ilonwy to follow quickly, Taran ran ahead. He stopped suddenly. To his left, on a high shelf of rock, crouched an enormous wolf with golden eyes and a lolling red tongue. Before Taran could draw his sword, the animal sprang, which will bring us to Chapter 13, The Hidden Valley.